Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about a very specific component of communication style. We're going to talk about how you identify which of the two camps you fall into when it comes to how you ask and respond to questions and requests. I want to give credit to Esther Perel as part of this idea, something that I've talked about as a therapist. I've gone through this with people in assertive communication training, and she really gave me some language and identification labels to help us make this even more clear to talk about this concept of how we as humans interact with each other in one of our primary forms of communication, which is requests and responses. So we're going to talk about whether or not you are an asker or a guesser. An asker or a calculator. Now, again, some of these terms came from a talk that I heard from her, and they're things that are likely conversations and identities that you've heard described in different ways throughout your time. What I want to do is go over a little bit about what each type is, help you figure out where you land, and then think about the pros and cons to both types and how, depending on the way that we identify, we can engage more effectively with the people around us. So an asker is somebody that believes that they can put their ask out into the world, and they have the right to make a request, to put an ask out into the world, and that people have the right to say no. This tends to fall more in line with an assertive communication style. It's the belief that I am independent of the person that I'm asking. Both of us have the right to respond however we want to, and it's not my job or responsibility to try to over-assess what that other person might be thinking or feeling, either prior to making or after they respond to my request. The guesser or the calculator works a little bit differently. They like to think about all the possibilities before they make a request. Before they consider asking you if you can take something on, if it's maybe at work, if it's a partner, a friend, they're going to consider everything else that's already on your plate. They're going to think about, would you even want to say yes? Do you want to do this thing? Whatever the case may be, they're already doing some of this internal factoring and having a dialogue prior to the ask even being made. Now we can see that both sides likely have some benefits and some drawbacks, right? So askers have this benefit of being able to separate themselves and their responsibility in the world from those around them. We're not assuming, if we're an asker, that if you say no to me, that it's personal. That if you tell me you're not interested in something or can't do something, that it's because you don't care about me. We're simply saying, hey, I'm going to put this out there. I'm going to let you take it. I'm going to put ownership into the camp that it belongs. But sometimes we can be perceived as overstepping. For an asker, we might ask somebody something and they might assume, how did they not know that I'm already so busy or so overwhelmed? What about if I am in a position where I feel obligated to say yes to them? Or they might assume that we're in a position of power or authority, and if we don't say yes, we're letting them down. And so there's a lot of misinterpretations if I'm an asker and I'm using that style to communicate with somebody that's maybe a guesser or a calculator. Because again, their brain is going to be thinking and processing a little bit differently than mine did. This is also similar to, I don't know if any of you had a friend or had a person that you had in school that might have invited themselves over. They would ask if they could come along. This is another example of being an asker. Sometimes, obviously, those people might take things personally. That's independent. But a lot of times people just feel like they have the right to ask, and they need to put something out there for you to know, what do they want? What are they looking for? So again, some pros, but also sometimes some tension that can get in the way, because you can be perceived as someone that is maybe overstepping or not considering other people purely based on the culture that we exist in, and this belief that we're always sort of overvaluing and maybe assessing everything before we make any type of decision. On the flip side, the calculator or the guesser is likely going to be perceived as being really compassionate, really empathetic. They are somebody that is able to really consider other people's feelings and wants. However, again, those assumptions might get them into some trouble as well, because some things might happen, particularly if we're maybe more passive, if we have a narrative around our own worth and value. We might believe that we don't have the right to make asks of other people, or we make assumptions that they're going to say no, or they're going to be irritated, or they might feel obligated and we don't want them to do that. And so we just don't even ask. And in a lot of ways, this can perpetuate a shame-based narrative and getting us to think that either we don't have the right to ask, or if we do ask and somebody responds maybe neutrally or negatively, we might make the assumption that that's about us. So both types of communicators really have value and benefit. What we want to consider in terms of how we identify and how we're engaging in the world is realizing that there are both types of communicators. And there are a lot of other types of communication components and styles and things that I know I've talked about. If you've been a part of my Level Up Assertive Communication course, you have learned all about these things at this point. But the reality is, when it comes to requests, when it comes to asks, we really do tend to fall in more of that assertive communicator style, or more of that reactive and attached, so think more emotion-based style. So what do we do with that? Well, if we're askers, I think it's really important for us to consider this comes from this space of honoring other people's mentality, other people's right to say no, maybe not assuming a responsibility for things that aren't ours, or expecting them to assume a responsibility that isn't theirs. And when we're communicating with people with there may be more guessers or calculators, we might have to do and say a little bit more just to hold that space. So as an asker, I might say, hey, I just want to put this out there. There's no obligation. Would you be open to doing blank? Or if I put a request, let's say in an email, or I am texting somebody to ask them something, I might want to make sure that I add in this layer of kind of permission giving if I know that I tend to be an asker and maybe the people I'm interacting with are more calculators. The other thing that I might say is, I want you to know that if you don't want to do this, it's not personal, right? Or maybe I'm even modeling, not upfront with the request, but when somebody responds with a no, or I can pick up on a hesitation, or maybe I'm kind of seeing and learning this person's styles, maybe more of a calculator or a guesser, making space and saying, you know what? I just want you to know it's perfectly okay if you can't do that. And making that space for them and maybe some permission giving so that they can shift from that narrative. The other thing that I think is really important when you're more of that asker mentality, if other people are putting requests out to you, again, consider those people might be more the guessers and the calculators. And so if they've done that, they might actually feel a little bit more of a personal affront if you say no, or if you can't do something. And so it might be really important just to make space for that. Again, that doesn't mean that you need to take on that responsibility, because ultimately how they react and respond is their own responsibility. But I know for me, as I worked on becoming more of an assertive communicator, and I really moved from that guesser or calculator into the asker phase, it was really important to me when I was able to recognize that potentially I was interacting with some guessers and calculators, that I made space to just honor their request, even if I was still practicing assertive communication. Perhaps that's if you are then on the flip side. If you are a calculator or a guesser, how do we think about how we're engaging with other people around us? So when it comes to others making a request of us, when we find ourselves getting that sort of jarring response, or feeling like something is wrong, that they shouldn't have asked, how do they not know I have this going on, or we feel a pressure or an obligation, maybe pause and check in with yourself if, again, this is sort of that internal dialogue and responsibility that you're taking on that's not totally fair for you to assume, and how you might be able to shift from that. How you might be able to say, oh, maybe their intention wasn't to overstep and to hurt me. Even if they were a calculator or a guesser, maybe they just got it wrong. Maybe they didn't know, right? And then on the flip side, when other people are making requests of us, particularly maybe if we're engaging with someone who's more of an asker and we're responding, one of the things that we can do is really, again, honor the fact that not everybody's going to take things personal, and to make that shift internally to maybe not feeling the need to explain everything. And that's important for two reasons. If we're responding to an asker or a guesser, there's kind of a benefit either way. If I'm responding to an asker, they're not looking for a response. They're not looking for my explanation. And so I'm starting to hardwire my brain that I don't owe everybody that. But secondly, if I'm communicating with another guesser or calculator, I'm also starting to model that I can compassionately decline, say no, or have an opinion that might be different than what they're looking for without having to provide some sort of explanation or make it better for them, to help them see that they have the right to do that, and I would honor that, as well as to detach myself from the responsibility of owning somebody else's response. So that's it. Again, thinking about which side you fall on, how you might be able to start making some shifts in the way that you engage with those around you. If you are looking to go deeper on anything related to assertive communication, communication styles, I highly encourage you to comment, write your questions below, and check out my Level Up 10-week assertive communication course. We are very much in the mind of how do we shift and change the way we think, talk, act, and speak. Think, talk, act, and feel, all in relation to really making those shifts into becoming more of that assertive, independent person that makes space for themselves and others. Anything else